that, or? Okay, just
You
whatever.
bet.
I left some materials on the table you may have seen on the way in. Feel free to help yourself to those. My name's Mike Anderson. I'm the Upper Cumberland Regional Director for the Tennessee Suicide Prevention Network, which you saw me roll my eyes. It's kind of a ridiculous title. Directors supervise people. I don't supervise anybody. I run around making people aware of suicide and how it affects our community and the warning signs, how you can put your concern into action. That's what I'll be talking. Since I have 30 minutes or so, I'm going to focus my time on something called QPR, which stands for Question, Persuade, and Refer. It is just like I presented it. It's not intended to try to convince you to be a counselor or a therapist or anything like that. It's intended to offer hope in a moment of concern or a moment of crisis. What we find at Tennessee Suicide Prevention Network is that people don't need to be trained in warning signs. We find that people are typically seeing those. We'll go through a couple of warning signs and things. They're fairly classic. I don't think it's going to surprise anybody. They rarely do. However, what we find is that people who are concerned, the training, and this is a spoiler alert, is to convince people that if you're in a moment where you're concerned, to feel empowered to ask that person if they're having thoughts of suicide. That may sound simplistic, it may sound a little direct, but frankly, it's the most effective tool in the toolbox, and we've shown that through many different peer-reviewed studies. I don't know the number, there's several hundred. SAMHSA did a big one in 2015 and spent a lot of our tax dollars on that, but it's been shown time and time again that communities that have a more open dialogue about mental health and about suicide, or maybe have billboards up and things like this, tend to have a lower suicide rate. Now, talking about suicide is obviously a life and death topic. Most of us have been impacted or touched by suicide loss in some way in our life. Sometimes the things I talk about can cause people to relive painful memories. That is not my purpose today. And if you are stepping out just to go to the restroom, maybe give me a thumbs up on your way out. But if you leave, I'm going to check on you to make sure you're okay, because again, this is a topic of life and death, and I take it very seriously. Now, I am a personality that tends to try to find humor in things. I may make a lighthearted joke. I joke about life, I never joke about death, so don't ever misunderstand anything I'm saying to you. I won't make light of suicide in any way. If I make a silly remark about our community or myself, it's usually self-deprecating. You'll see what I mean later. Let's open up with a couple of myths versus facts. By the way, QPR Institute is based in Tacoma, Washington. The Quinnett family, father and son, are both doctors. The son actually played the NBA for a while, Brian Quinnett. You can check me on that. I didn't know that till a couple of years ago. I was like, really, Brian? Dr. Quinnett played it? He sure did. I mean, I knew he was 6'7" or whatever, but yeah, he played the NBA for a time. So his father and he created this many years ago. The QPR Institute, they base their information on peer-reviewed case studies. What's a case study? Well, with respect to suicide in the QPR Institute, when someone has attempted, or maybe they had ideas about suicide or plans of suicide, or in the event someone's died by suicide, they will interview either the person who had suicidal thoughts, if they're available, or the people around that person who was lost to suicide. We call those survivors of suicide. And they'll talk to that person and interview them about what they were feeling or what they observed during that time. So then those studies and case studies are peer-reviewed, and that's why you'll find QPR as a curriculum is included in SAMHSA's National Evidence-Based Programs and Practices. Evidence-based meaning that it's been peer-reviewed and shown to be effective. And again, spoiler, the methodology behind pretty much any suicide prevention training that you will ever take, because we have some that are 30 minutes like today, or an hour. Those are most of what we do, but we do have some in-depth trainings that can last up to 2 days, 2 full days. I've been through a 4-day long suicide prevention training. They all focus around one central theme, is that if you are seeing warning signs and you're concerned, please feel empowered to ask the person if they are having thoughts of suicide. You ever heard of fight or flight? If you're in the woods and you see a mountain lion, that's where fight or flight kicks in. You're either going to have to fight for your life or run away. In interpersonal relationships, the flight mechanism is often replaced by something called freeze. And that's the same mechanism in play in your human anatomy and in the way you're thinking. And that's, we don't want to say the wrong thing. We don't want to put the idea of suicide in somebody's mind. So we're concerned and we don't know what to say. So we just sort of shut down and try to be there for the person. That's what we find most common in these situations. And we're here to tell you that the most effective thing you can do is clarify with the person and be deliberate. Now, I'm jumping way ahead, so I'll jump back into this. Here are some common myths versus facts that we see in case studies and anecdotally around my travels. One common myth is that nobody can stop suicide. It's going to happen no matter what. What we actually find is that if people in crisis get the help they need, they'll probably never be suicidal again. Everybody wants me to attach a percentage to that. What's the survivability of that? I don't know. It's hard to get doctors or clinicians to put a number on something. They don't want to get sued, I think. We do find more often than not that if somebody has had thoughts of suicide, they've recovered, they're in treatment now, or they're seeing a therapist on a continuous basis, probably never going to get quite to that point again. Another myth is that asking a person about suicide will make them angry or increase the risk of suicide. That's categorically false. What we find is that asking somebody directly about their suicidal thoughts or intent has been shown to lower anxiety, open up communication, and lower the risk of a suicide attempt. Now, I had to swallow this when I first heard this message in 2018. I've had this job since November 15th of 2018. It's hard to believe it's been that long. But when I first heard that message, somebody who's lived with depression since he was 14 years old, I don't know that I believed that immediately. I had to drive. That's what I do when I think. I drive. And I've got a long way to drive because I drive back and forth on 111 every day. And I remember I was in Rickman and it hit me, oh, what does talk therapy do and what has it done in my life? Okay, there's something about the human condition that requires us in many cases to express our feelings. And a lot of people do that through art. A lot of people do that through music or exercise or different things. A lot of people just need to talk about what they're going through. There's something about the human condition, this is just me talking, not the program, but there's something about the human condition that forces us to express what we're feeling, especially if it's pain. And if we're not expressing that, then bad things tend to happen. And that's one thing I think that's happening here, and certainly what it felt like for me in talk therapy. So that's just one way I understood this and helped me to sort of swallow that. One has skipped. I'm going to jump back to my keyboard because my clicker's going out on it. Another myth is that only experts can prevent suicide. Actually, if we can make suicide prevention everybody's business, we believe we can save a lot of lives. Let me give you an example of why we think this way. Everybody's heard of CPR. CPR has done a couple of things really well in about the last 50 years or so. And what it's done is arm the general public with what a warning sign for a heart attack or cardiac event looks like. It has armed you with the knowledge that you need to call 911 and do chest compressions until help arrives, right? And that has been very effective. Why do I say it's been very effective? Well, because you know about it, for one thing. Everybody knows about it. But the American Heart Association looked at it and said, are we doing any good with this? Back in 2012. I wish they'd do a more modern study. But in 2012, they found that 92,000 Americans in that year alone were saved by bystander CPR. That's a lot of life that was saved. You know, in the old days, they say, it's your ticker. Your heart went out. What can you do about it? There's nothing you can do about it. They just died. You don't think that way, especially living in the great city of Cookeville. We have one of the best heart facilities over there in Cookeville Regional. My stepdad just underwent open heart surgery about 4 weeks ago. He was mowing the lawn 2 weeks after his open heart surgery. So it's, you know, we believe we're at that same point with mental health first aid trainings like this QPR. And again, it may seem a little simplistic to say that if you see something, say something. If you're worried about suicide, ask about suicide. But really, CPR has saved a lot of life with a simple message just like that. Another myth is, boy, that thing really wants to jump ahead, doesn't it? Another myth is that people considering suicide keep their plans to themselves. I hear this one a lot personally. What we find in case studies is that if somebody is contemplating suicide, they will communicate that intent a week, maybe 10 days prior to their attempt. Most often it's not a direct statement. I'll cover that in just a minute. Another myth is that people who talk about suicide are just looking for attention, or they won't really do anything. What we find is that if people are talking about it, it's on their mind, and we'd advise you to take all warning signs seriously. Another myth is that once somebody decides to die by suicide, there's nothing we can do to save them. You know, this statement on the right here has been taken in the wrong way before, and we've inadvertently hurt people's feelings, or there's been some misunderstanding. When they say suicide is the most preventable kind of event, we try to curtail that a little bit and say it's one of the most preventable. What they mean to say is that you can't always fix cancer. You can't always fix a bad heart. But suicide is unique. If you can change that person's mind, you can change the outcome, and you can save that person's life. So as horrible and as much life is lost by suicide, there is that hope in this equation, is that if we can change, if we can offer hope to that person, if we can change their mind in that moment, or get that person to accept help in that moment, we can save that life, which is, we can't always say that about cancer or heart disease or diabetes or some of these other illnesses. So how can I help? Ask the question. Again, I know that may seem a little simplistic. Usually when I've got, like a full hour, I'll show a few slides talking about the Upper Cumberland. You've heard me talk enough to know at this point that I am a country boy. There's no hiding this accent. I grew up in Overton County, just across the line. I tell everybody I'm from Cookeville. That's not true. I'm from Rickman. Rickman is not even really a suburb of Cookeville, but there's just no hiding the biscuits and gravy and this accent. It pours out of me, and I can't hide it. I am local. I grew up here my whole life, and growing up here, I had never heard that the Upper Cumberland, even that word, the Upper Cumberland, that phrase, heard that whole life. I just thought, oh, that's some byword phrase we use for describing living around Cookeville. It is actually a well-defined 14-county region, which is my work region. I work all 14 counties, known as the Upper Cumberland. And I had never heard that the Upper Cumberland had the highest suicide rate in Tennessee. That's not a 1-year thing. That's not anomalous. It's been going on for a while. I've got numbers in my computer right now that show it clearly from 2015 forward. Everything I have as in my position leads me to believe it's been the same trend all the way back to 1981. Now, they weren't cataloging numbers quite as well as they are now back then, but most of what I have leads me to believe that's a long-term trend for maybe 40 years or so. We don't have quite the crime rate that Nashville or Knoxville or Memphis has, and it surprised me deeply, being a son of the Upper Cumberland here, or a child of the Upper Cumberland growing up here, that this is kind of like Mayberry. When I grew up, Cookeville had 2 Shoney's. We had one on Jefferson and one on Willa. One to catch all the church crowds. We had Shoney's for everybody. And if you have 2 Shoney's in your town, I believe you are in fact Mayberry. You could walk down Jefferson tonight with a $20 bill in your hand, and I'd be willing to bet that $20 bill you probably won't get mugged. I can't say the same thing for Memphis. Memphis is a big city. They have big city problems, but their suicide rate is 1/3 of what it is here in the Upper Cumberland. So just because we don't have a high crime rate doesn't mean we don't have a high suicide rate. And I think that sometimes gets overlooked. I don't know if it's something people are so uncomfortable about they don't want to talk about. One other trend that we've seen, long-term trend, is that more Tennesseans tended to die by suicide than in car crashes. It's actually car and motorcycle crashes combined. Now, in the last 3 years, that's kind of changed a little bit, only because car crash fatalities have skyrocketed so much. And people want to know why. I don't know why. That's not my field. Probably cell phones. But up until 3 years ago, I could say that to kind of grab people's attention. More people die by suicide. I'm getting off topic, but I just want you to understand that suicide is a very relevant topic for public health and public safety, particularly in a rural area like the Upper Cumberland. And a lot of times people are like, well, what's going on in the Upper Cumberland? I don't know. I can tell you that in rural areas, you tend to see a higher suicide rate nationally. If you look at like Wyoming, the Dakotas, Idaho, Oregon, places like this, you're going to find a higher suicide rate than you would in New York City or Los Angeles or Chicago. And what we think we see in that is that since there is such a higher concentration of mental health providers and even ERs, that are closer to people. The other thing that probably doesn't get mentioned is that when you live in a city, you tend to live in, say, apartments or very close to your nearest neighbor, whereas country folk tend to really value our privacy. You know, and if you live way out in the west somewhere, it may be 40 miles to your next neighbor. So, you know, it's the other thing, the cultural thing is that country people tend to keep to themselves. We're not always forthcoming about the problems we're dealing with, and I think that's a cultural thing. Again, I'm getting off topic, but I typically give people more information about why I do what I do and how relevant suicide is in this area, in this region. But, you know, the thing to keep in mind is that the most effective tool in our immediate toolbox is to be empowered. If you're seeing warning signs, to ask that person if they're having thoughts of suicide. Don't be afraid of that conversation, and always refer that person to a competent mental health professional. And I'm way off the map now. I've jumped back and forth in this whole PowerPoint. I'll kind of get back on task here because my time is limited. But obviously take all signs seriously. The more warning signs you see, the more risk you can feel that you can associate with the situation. There will be things like direct verbal clues. I'll go ahead and tell you these are kind of rare. More often than that, we find indirect verbal clues. It's a rare state, and you'll see these in a moment. But behavioral clues and situational clues. And this is one of those things where I like to warn people. You're going to see quotation marks. The quotation marks are real quotes that came directly from a case study. Again, if you've ever lost somebody, this can be kind of painful. I just want you to be aware of that before I show you some of these clues. And I'm not saying these things lightly. I take this stuff very seriously and I try to warn you about where we're going with this before I jump into it. Statements like, I've decided to kill myself. I wish I were dead. I'm going to commit suicide. I'm going to end it all. Or if such and such doesn't happen, then I'll kill myself. These are very direct. There's very little to the imagination about what these people were saying. I mean, they're being very great. They're actually kind of rare statements. More often than these, I hate to attach a number or a ratio to it, but my guess would be probably 1 in 10 would say something direct. Most of the time, you're going to find indirect clues, something vague or a little bit vague or maybe a little ominous. I'm tired of life. I feel like I can't go on. My family would be better off without me. I don't know if anybody cares if I'm dead or not. I just want out. And that's a big one that kind of goes underreported. People will report feelings of feeling trapped, like they can't get out of a situation. That goes sort of hand in hand with depression and thoughts of suicide. I won't be around much longer, or pretty soon you won't have to worry about me. I can tell you anecdotally, locally, I've had people report to me a statement like, hey, if anything ever happens to me, or I just want you to know you've been a good friend or a good family member. Something along those lines, some vague. And you know, this can sometimes cause survivors, someone who's lost somebody to suicide, to feel feelings of guilt. Like, you know, how come I couldn't see more? Well, they're not telling you directly. You know, when you look back on it, how could you do anything different? Because, you know, they'll say, well, it caught me kind of odd in that moment, but looking back on it, they were, you know, now at hindsight's 20/20. So we tell people, don't feel guilt when you look back on something, because every day you're always doing the best that you can, and people are not telling you their plan for the most part. That's why we talk about warning signs, and we tell everybody to, you know, if you have a feeling, if you are concerned, don't be afraid to talk about or to have a conversation about mental health in general or suicide. Behavioral clues would include things like any previous suicide attempt, acquiring a gun or stockpiling pills, co-occurring depression, moodiness, or hopelessness. I would underline the word hopelessness. If everything you're observing in someone seems to be governed by under this umbrella of hopelessness, you know, it's just, there's no point. That's kind of, and again, I said this earlier, but most of the time these warning signs don't really shock anyone. There's nothing really surprising about these warning signs. They're the typical things you would generally see. Putting their personal affairs in order, giving away prized possessions, a sudden interest or disinterest in religion. I call that one the eyebrow raiser. I generally get at least one eyebrow raise at that one. I've actually had somebody say, now wait a minute, you mean everybody gets born again is thinking about killing themselves? No, that's not what we're seeing. What we are seeing in case studies is that when someone has died by suicide or had thoughts about suicide, it's very common that they've been studying religions with an S on the end of it. Evidently, if you're thinking about what happens to us after death, medical science doesn't really have any information about that. Once your life is over, that's where medical science stops. Religions, however, the different religions of the world, all religions, have an abundance of information about that topic. What we find is it's very common if someone's contemplating suicide or having thoughts of suicide that they have been studying religions, evidently to try to learn, what might happen to me after this. Drug or alcohol abuse, especially if we're talking about somebody who struggled with addiction, they went through a period of recovery and they slip and use again, that can be very traumatic for someone struggling with addiction. Unexplained anger, aggression, and irritability. Situational clues can include things like being fired from a job or expelled from school, a recent unwanted move, loss of any major relationship, death of a spouse, child, or best friend. See the dash, especially if it was by way of suicide. We don't really understand that phenomenon. It exists. I've seen it in my personal life. The first experience I ever had with suicide as a very young person at 11 years old was right here in this town, an entire family, within a matter of a year and a half. Since I've had this job in the last 6 years doing these presentations, I'm throttling myself and not talking about that situation as much as I used to, because in just doing these talks that I do, I've met the police officer that responded and the EMT person that responded to that situation. The gentleman that we knew involved in it worked with my mom back in 1990. His parents both died by suicide, and so did he, within a year and a half or so of each other. It exists. That happens, and it's just one of those things to keep in mind. Diagnosis of a serious or terminal illness, a sudden unexpected loss of freedom or fear of impending punishment, anticipated loss of financial security, loss of a therapist, counselor, or teacher. I wish they'd change that one. What we're really talking about there is like a mentor figure, somebody someone looks up to, or fear of becoming a burden to others. Now, I'm going to, at the risk of going off topic, I want to say a licensed person looked at this list one time and came up to me after it and said, in my practice, what this is really saying is that if somebody's identity is threatened or taken away from them. Now, if you watch a lot of TV in this day and age, the moment you hear the word identity, we're sort of conditioned to think gender identity, sexual orientation. Okay, yeah, that's part of it, but it's bigger than that. It's broader. You think about somebody that's worked the same job for 40 years. Suddenly gets fired and can't work anymore, or maybe they've had a recent unwanted move. That's kind of a universal age thing. You could be talking about a very young person that doesn't want to move across the country because mom and dad have a new job that's going to take them away from all their friends and family they've known their whole life. It could be an older folks who are facing maybe having to live in assisted living now, don't want to move out of the home they built and lived in for the last 50 or 70 years. There are a lot of these that aren't really pigeonholed into one particular demographic or another. That's why this list, I say it's broad and it's kind of classic, is because even though everybody's life is different, what happens to you may not happen to me, and vice versa. When we look through case studies, there are 6 or 8 things that keep popping up. And that's why we show these to folks, just to reinforce that if you are seeing warning signs, if that little voice in your head is saying there's something going on, listen to that voice, because your intuition is probably stronger than you think it is. I think my slideshow has like a smooth delay and my computer can't handle it, so when I click it jumps, and that's why I maybe having issues with it. So I've been thinking about that as I talk. So tips for asking or talking about suicide. If you're ever in doubt, don't wait. Feel empowered. If I were standing here sweating and I was reaching over and grabbing an arm, maybe I was doing this, and I was having shortness of breath and leaning, and if I was physically failing in front of you, and huffing and puffing and sweating and grabbing my arm, somebody, I feel like, I don't know this, obviously, but I feel like most people would not be afraid to say, "Are you okay? You look like you might be having a heart attack." But there's something about mental health in general, and particularly suicide, that puts the brakes on people, and it makes us freeze, right? It makes us you know, that fight or flight thing, because it's scary. We're looking at life and death. There's also a component in society that conditions us to think that if we talk about mental health with someone, I don't want to insult them. I don't want them to think that I think they're crazy or there's something wrong with them. We have to get past that. We have to start seeing mental health for what it is, which is just another part of your physical well-being. I have a slide, not in this slideshow. These are new slides. I'm sorry, I'm using you as guinea pigs today, but I really wanted to see this nice, modern, cool slideshow. But my regular old workhorse PowerPoint has two different brains. PET scans of two different brains. One is what they call neurotypical. I got in trouble for saying normal. I got in trouble for saying average. This person was neurotypical. Okay, they're not normal, they're not average. The person on the right side of the screen in my slideshow has been diagnosed with clinical depression, and what you find is there's a lot less electrical activity in that brain, particularly in the frontal lobe, which is the part of the brain they say is most makes us human, or makes us most human, separates us from the animal kingdom. And the reason I show that to folks is that it proves, at least in my mind, that we're talking about a very real physical illness. And there is no health without mental health. And I always press that point. It may feel a little preachy from me, but that point is so relevant that it reframes the conversation. Mental health is not a decision someone's making. And that sometimes is a hard, pardon the analogy, but sometimes that's a hard pill for people to swallow, is that they're like, well, they just need to straighten up and get over it. You know, well, that's not the case when it comes to things like clinical depression or anxiety. You know, there is a very real difference in someone feeling sad, which is an emotion, and having depression, which typically, and I hate using this phrase, but it typically means it's 2 weeks or more, and it limits you from doing the things that you normally do. I'm not a clinician, but that's the kind of language they will use when they diagnose this sort of thing, or describe it, I should say. If the person is reluctant, be persistent. Expect someone to be reluctant. One, they probably feel like they've exhausted all of their options. They've probably been living with this for a time, maybe decades. And they probably feel like most people can't understand what they're going through. So if you're worried about somebody, don't be afraid to be. I have a co-trainer, and she's a very great volunteer in our network. She's very active. She's retired now, so she's a full-time volunteer. And when I say full-time, she puts in overtime every week. But she says lovingly persistent is what, and you'd have to know this lady to know what she, because it's funny coming from her, because you're not going to get away from that particular person. She's very persistent when she's after something. But another one is to talk to the person alone in a private setting, let them talk in their own language. I hope you're never involved in a suicide intervention, but if you are, it's probably going to be somebody very close to you. The reason is because you'll be close enough to see the warning signs and the change in behavior. I have a bad habit. I think it comes. I'm blaming it on my previous work history. I used to be in commission-based sales when I was in college, and I was conditioned to talk fast and try to sell as many things as I could. Not that I was a dirty car salesman, but probably worse, I was a dirty TV salesman. And, you know, the HD TV craze back in those days. And, you know, we had to talk facts and figures real quick. So I have a real bad habit in my personal life. When somebody tells me something, doesn't matter how wonderful or terrible it is, many times I will rephrase that and say it back to them. What I'm trying to do is understand what they're telling me, because I'm not very smart, and that's the way I understand things. What happens is people sometimes tend to shut down. They're like, oh, you're just going to talk over me. And I don't mean that. It's just the only way I can understand it, because it's just who I am. And I have to be careful when people are talking to me about things like emotions or things that are pain or something they're trying to express to me. I have to think about my own response and not talk over them. I have to let them talk in their own language. Give yourself plenty of time. If you don't have time, try to help that person find someone who does have time. Have your resources handy. They talk about a QPR code or a card and things like that. That used to be something we really, you know, shoved a lot of resources. You've already got something that says 988 on it. Now, the blue bracelets have that old number on it. It still works. It's just that in the last 2 years now, since 988 happened, all you have to remember is 988. Whereas we used to tell people the phone line to call is 800-273-TALK, like the bracelet. If you want to text, you can text 741-741. And now all you have to do is remember is 988. Because you can call it, you can text it, you can get on a computer and chat with someone if you just remember 988. Which it literally took an act of Congress, by the way, to make that happen. You know, we make jokes about an act of Congress. It literally took an act, right in the midst of COVID. Your federal government did something worthwhile finally. It was June of 2020, and I sat in my little office at Plateau Mental Health Center, and I listened to a congressional hearing via a phone line and speakerphone, and there was nobody in the building to hear me cheer when they finally passed that. It took 20 years to get them to pass that. How you ask the question of someone is less important than the fact that you actually ask it. I will tell you that if you are worried about suicide, be deliberate. And we've talked about direct and indirect. Be deliberate. Some people hurt themselves as a way to cope with stress. I don't condone that. It's not a good coping skill, but it exists. Sometimes they refer to themselves as cutters. It's technically referred to as self-harm. I know someone right now works in mental health and has for years. She helps thousands of people in this town. I don't even know how many. Month in, month out, she's very good at her job, and she's got a big heart when it comes to helping people. I know that person well enough to know that if she gets to a certain level of stress, she will cut her arms. She is not doing that to try to die. She's doing that to feel, in her words, to feel something other than what she is feeling right now. Now, why am I able to quote her? Because I asked her if she was thinking about suicide because I was worried about her. I've asked her more than once. She wears long sleeves year round, be 100 degrees, and she's going to wear a jacket or she's going to wear a long sleeve shirt. Want to know why? Because she's got scars on her arms. She doesn't want people to see that. But my point is, if you're worried about suicide, don't fall into the trap of saying, well, you're not thinking about hurting yourself, are you? Because someone could say, no, don't worry about that. Just, oh, thank God. We'll see you in church on Wednesday. And you think everything's fine. And they're not lying to you. They're thinking about suicide. They're not thinking about hurting themselves. So if you're worried about suicide, see, that's one of the traps that good, caring people fall into, path of least resistance. Remember, suicide is a very life and death. It's a very hard thing to even think about. It's a hard thing to talk about. And so I always caution people, if you're worried about suicide, ask about suicide. Another thing, I'm going to tell you another trap we fall into, particularly as Southerners here in just a second. But QPR, as the nice little PowerPoint displays here, QPR stands for question, persuade, and refer. The idea is that if you're worried and you're seeing warning signs, be empowered. Ask that question. Are you struggling? Are you depressed? You feel like you're depressed? Is it so bad that you caught yourself wishing you weren't alive anymore? You know, however you phrase that, whatever you know about the person and situation, be empowered to have that conversation. Persuade that person to live. I don't know how to persuade people to live. I wish I did. I'd be out of a job real quick, but I'd gladly end my tenure if we knew that answer. Use whatever you know about the situation to offer hope. And if you can't offer hope, create doubt. You know, I'm shameless when it comes to saving somebody's life. You know, I actually saw a role play, it was a reenactment of someone who wasn't getting anywhere with a message of hope. So out of desperation, they finally said, well, what about your cat? Have you thought about who's going to feed your cat? Oh, crap, I hadn't thought of that. And that was the little, that's all. So yeah, if you can't offer hope, create doubt. Whatever it takes. Persuade that person, because studies show us that from the moment someone decides, okay, I have a plan, I'm going to act on it, there's less than 5 minutes before they act on that plan. And as I mentioned earlier, if you can interrupt that process, if you can get them through it or you can get them around it, the likelihood of them getting back to that point is actually pretty low. That's what we find. Now, it's not saying that what they're going through isn't very real. It is very real. One problem with suicide is that neurotypical, not normal, not average, it's alien to that brain to think about because we have a survival instinct. Suicide is kind of unique in that situation. So just keep those things in mind and do anything you can to persuade them to live, and always, always refer that person to a competent mental health professional. We are dealing with a disease We are not dealing with all suck it up and get over it. It is not an emotion we're dealing with. We are dealing with something in the brain that is overriding the self-preservation mechanism. It is often, it is not a problem to this person, it is a solution. So remember that suicide in this person's mind is not the problem. Again, to ask the question, you may take a less direct approach. Some people like that. I'm not going to read it word for word. We're running out of time quickly here. I will mention that a lot of people like this last one because suicide is such a difficult topic to talk about. Again, it's life and death. As I mentioned, if you're ever involved in a suicide intervention, and I hope and pray you're not, but if you are, it's probably going to be somebody very close to you because you'll be close enough to see warning signs. Now, that's a double-edged sword in a way of saying, because let me offer my life as an example. I do this for a living. They pay me to do this. I've been doing it for 6 years. I run around 14 counties giving this message that if you see something, say something. Don't be afraid to talk about suicide. Okay, let me put my remote down. Having said that, now I'm not on the job, right? If my mother were the one that was presenting warning signs to me, could I ask my mom if she was having thoughts of suicide? I've been asking that question for 6 years. I don't have an answer. I swear I don't know if I could or not. I want to think, yep, Superman Kate, no problem. I'm on it. I don't know if I could or not. I feel confident I could spot warning signs, but I don't know if, why? Because I don't want to think about my mom dying. I don't want my mom, especially, I don't want my mom to deal with that, and I don't want her to say, yes, I'm having thoughts of suicide. I don't want to face that. Fight or flight. I'm wanting to get away from that problem, right? I don't want it's easier for me to just hope things get better and check on her tomorrow, right? That's what good, caring people, the trap that we fall into with respect to suicide. It's what everything inside of us screams to do is, well, I don't want to say the wrong thing. And that's what happens to people. And so that's why the trainings that you see for suicide prevention always focus around if you see something, if you are worried, don't be afraid to talk to that person. Ask them if they're having thoughts of suicide and refer that person to a competent mental health professional, even if all you know is 988, because that's open 24 hours a day, 365. It's a free resource. And one of the hard facts about mental health in any emergency, really, is that they don't always happen Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, when therapist offices are open. Many times it's Christmas Eve at 11:30 a.m. or 11:30 p.m. rather. So a direct approach, you could be very direct. These are very direct. Now, all these have quotation marks. It's my understanding all these came from successful interventions. That last one is very direct. Are you thinking about killing yourself? I don't know. There is a time to be direct. If you're worried about what's going to happen in the next 5 minutes, it may be a time to be direct. I can't tell you which is right. I don't want to endorse either method. Use your knowledge of the person, the situation, and the time frame as to how to respond to this. I will say the one thing about that last one, though, and this one, two sides of this, direct and indirect. Direct, this is not a leading question. It is open-ended. Have you had thoughts about killing yourself? This is less direct, and people like this last one. Do you ever wish you could go to sleep and not wake up? That's where I was going a minute ago when I got off track talking about what if my mom. Sometimes it's easier for folks to kind of backdoor the topic because with my mom, say, I don't know if I could ask her if she was having thoughts of killing herself. Would it be easier for me to say, well, have you ever caught yourself wishing you could go to sleep and just not wake up? That's an easier way to talk about it. Now, I will say, again, if you find that you just can't do it and you're worried, find someone who can talk about that, because that's what we find most often. Here we go. Anybody ever rode a horse? If you ever rode a horse, you go out, maybe a lot of times it's at these barns, these like businesses. You ride the horse, you're okay. When you come back, what does the horse do the moment it sees the stable? I don't care how tired that horse is. You're like, whoa, you might have been out for 3-4 hours or something. That horse is running. This is me trying to get to this slide before I run out of time today. I've been hustling and dropping hints. Here in Mayberry, here in Biscuits and Gravy Land in the good old South, and I wouldn't be anywhere else, just so you know, but we talk a certain way. That's why I don't read those quotes word for word. They could have come from anywhere in the nation. But we ask questions in negatives, and we don't think a thing about it. We do it all day long. I'll give you an example. Hey, you ain't ate lunch yet, have you? You ain't going to the store, or you wouldn't care to get me a Dr. Pepper when you're out, would you? Hey, you wouldn't care to pick that up there for me. You know, we don't think a thing about that. That's how we ask questions. Now that I've mentioned it, check yourself. As you go along, check yourself how many times you ask a question like this. It's just how we talk. And that may not be a South thing. It's just, this is where I live. I know we do it here. Regardless of the topic. And we do it in church, and we do it everywhere else. And when it comes to a topic like suicide, I have heard one of these. It was the third one. It was almost word for word. The problem is, and see the quotation marks, there's no wrong way to ask if somebody's okay. There is no wrong way to ask if somebody is struggling, or if they need help, or if they're having thoughts of suicide. What we find, though, is that when you ask in a negative, and negative is a harsh term, it doesn't really reflect what I mean by that, but it's a leading question. For instance, well, you're not thinking about killing yourself, are you? That's what will come out of your mouth if you've never thought about it. I almost bet folding money on it. You wouldn't do anything stupid, would you? What you're wanting to say to this person, let me read the third one. Suicide, that's a dumb idea. Surely you're not thinking about suicide. What you mean to say is, good, caring person, you know, somebody close to you is, hey, I want you to be okay. I don't want you to die, especially in that way. Please tell me you're going to be all right, and we can get through this. That's what you're trying to say. But what the person hears is, what they'll do 9 times out of 10 is shut down and give you the answer they think they're supposed to give. And that's what we find over and over and over again. And you come to this stalemate. You're worried. You're like, you're not thinking about killing yourself, are you? The little man that came to the library that day told me to ask. You know, I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. And they're like, oh, you know me. I'll be all right. You know, and what they are hearing is that you can't really understand what I'm going through, or you're not comfortable talking about this, or I don't want to let you down, so I'm just going to say I'm all right to make this uncomfortable situation go away. And that's what we find over and over and over. So again, there is no wrong way. Do everything you can, and don't let me step on your attempt, or however you want to try to help somebody. I mean, your attempt to help somebody. But if you can think in that moment to ask in an open-ended way, what we find in case studies is you'll have much more success in getting an honest response. Again, listen to that person, give them your full attention. Remember, to this person, suicide is not the problem, because good, caring people attack problems. We see a problem, we attack the problem. We fix the problem, we're fixers. With suicide, you have to keep in mind that in that person's mind, suicide is the solution. In fact, I'm going to go out on a very short limb here, and I'm just going to say to you, and you're going to have to take my word on it, and if you want to go check into it more, I encourage you to read about it. But in most instances, the person does not want to die. Suicide is not about a wish to die. It is about feeling like you have no other option. It is a solution to something else. So if you're attacking suicide, right, if you're a fixer, keep that in mind. That suicide feels like the problem. But there's something else. And so nobody dies by suicide for just one reason. So keep that in mind. I clicked it, but it's not clicking. Okay, maybe my battery died. Oh, there it goes. Yeah, ask that person if they will let you get them help, if they will go with you to get help. Is there something we can do? How can we keep you safe now? Because remember, mental health emergencies, or any emergency, doesn't necessarily happen 9 to 5. Now, 988 is a 24-hour resource. Mobile crisis is a 24-hour resource. Doesn't matter if it's at Christmas at 1 a.m. However, therapists and counselors do tend to keep office hours. And you know, people want to see things in black and white, when often we're operating in the gray. Maybe they don't have a plan. Maybe you're not necessarily worried in the next 5 minutes, but you're worried what might happen in the next 2 days. What if it's a weekend? What if it's a holiday weekend? What if it's Labor Day weekend? You know, so that's why I brought this Stanley Brown worksheet. I'm not advocating that. I just want people to understand that there are safe plans that are simple. There's a video. If you Google Stanley Brown, you'll find a short 30-second video that helps you step through how to fill one of those out. I don't want people to be afraid to have conversations about mental health, suicide risk, and helping somebody create a safe plan of resources and people they know immediately, what has worked for them in the past, to get through a time until the professional is there to help take over or to work through. Or what do they do in between therapy appointments? You know, what if it's not quite a crisis level? Because that's the thing, you know, okay, we got the crisis system, I'm here preaching 988, 988, 988. A lot of times we're operating just under crisis and emergency. It could rise to that, but we're just sort of under that and don't quite meet that crisis label, but it's close. So I just want people to understand that there are tools out there, there are things that we can do to help fill in the gap and bridge the gaps. And Safe for Now is a great conversation to have with somebody if they are struggling in this time, in this sort of cycle with this. Believe it when I say that people who are struggling with thoughts of suicide often believe they can't be helped. Remember, suicide is generally speaking is a solution to something else. A lot of times they feel like they've exhausted all of their options. Be persistent and don't be afraid to talk for some time and try to help somebody work through something like a safe plan or something. The best referral to a competent mental health professional would always involve going with somebody directly, but this is life we're talking about. There are no 100% guarantees, and you can talk to any doctor you ever meet. They may know how to cure a condition, but that doesn't mean the patient's going to take the medicine, right? So there's always two sides to this. So somebody may not be really willing to participate. They may say, well, I appreciate what you're doing. I'll keep it in mind, you know. So the second best referral would be to get a commitment from that person to accept help and maybe help them try to make some arrangements for a future time. And then there's the person that you may be just spider sense tingling and you're so worried, but they're telling you, look, I know you're probably worried. I'm going to be fine, and you just aren't getting anywhere. They're not going to participate in your well-meaning, very persistent approach, and they're just, because they have rights, they don't have to do it. So the third best referral may be to just give them information, like the little suicide prevention guy brought you some stickers or something. Say, hey, look, I get it, okay, but you know, just know that I care about you. There is somewhere to call if you're alone and you feel like you need to talk. 988 is a great resource. It doesn't mean the flashing lights are going to come. They handle everything. And they don't just handle suicide, by the way. They also handle things like eating disorders or feelings of nervousness or anxiousness. During COVID, I know it's story time again, but during COVID, like that first 3 months, around May, I think it was Channel 5 that ran with the story first. But after the first one did it, all 3 Nashville stations did. Or 4, there's 4. The first one got a hold of the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, which is the 988 folks. It wasn't back then, it was still 800-273-TALK. But they put out a quarterly report, and their quarterly report said that they had an 800%, and that's me, I'm sorry, I put it on vibrate, that they had an 800% increase in call volume during the first 3 months of 2020. And you know what the news station said? There's been an 800% increase in suicide since the beginning of COVID. And the other 3 news stations said, oh, so they jumped on it and said, oh, reportedly 800%, 8 times as many suicides as before COVID. They didn't bother to read the report, because the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is also the National Suicide Prevention and Crisis Lifeline. And when you actually look at the report, the majority of those calls coming in were about feelings of nervousness, anxiousness, and uncertainty. Well, holy Lord. Every news station had a ticker on saying how many people had caught COVID and how many people had died. And every newscaster said, we're all going to die from COVID. You know, of course, 24 hours. So anyway, just be aware that they don't just handle suicide. They handle all kinds of calls. Any willingness on your part to try to get that person to accept help, even if they're like, okay, maybe in the future, is a victory. Don't feel like you failed. Even if they're willing to take okay, I'll take one of your stickers or your bracelet. If that's all you were able to do, then please see that as a victory. And almost any effort to persuade somebody to live rather than die by suicide will almost always be met with some relief and agreement. Don't feel like you're going to get yelled at, or I don't have a single recorded instance of somebody getting angry because somebody was trying to see if somebody was okay. I keep waiting for a good, solid, hard evidence, you know, oh, be careful, don't say this, because they'll get mad at you. I don't have one. Almost any, now they may sidestep you and say, no, I'll be all right, you know, but I don't have one where anybody's gotten angry and blown up because somebody was asking if they were okay. So don't be afraid to have these conversations. And I promise I'm at the end. It probably feels like I'm continuing to go, but I'm at the end. Any encouragement, like I want you to live or I'm on your side, is a great thing to say. Like the SAFE plan, don't be afraid to help that person identify the resources and the people in their community that they can rely on for help. That's what SAFE plans basically do. I'm not sure I like this new PowerPoint. A team is often a good approach. A follow-up visit, a lot of times people will report that yes, I was having thoughts of suicide. Somebody asked me if I was having thoughts. That was the spark of what helped me get through it. What they don't know is that 2 days later, they sent me a text and just said, hey, I'm just checking. I just wanted to make sure everything went okay, you know. And they're like, they don't know they saved my life in that moment. So, you know, we call that closing the loop. You know, one little doubling back the check is a great strategy. It's been shown to be very effective in helping people. And let the person know you care about them. Remember that hope prevents suicide. It may feel like I'm not going to be able to do any good, but again, suicide is unique in the fact that it is the only disease where if somebody changes their mind, they will survive. So, you know, you can't always say that about cancer or heart disease. Again, I've talked about 988. The reason I bring the Stanley Brown is, one, people don't know about it. We lose somebody every 11 seconds to suicide in this world. A past attempt is the best future predictor of a future attempt. That's some people are better at wording that than I am, but I want you to feel empowered to do everything you can, including use tools that may feel like it was meant for a therapist or something. They're not. There is no requirement that you have a license or a PhD or anything to use a SAFE plan. That is a common sense tool, just like a med minder where you put your pills, and this one's for Monday, this one's for Tuesday. That's all a SAFE plan really is. Don't be afraid to use it. We're not trying to replace good qualified therapy, but you know, we've all got to pull together and use the tools we've got to get through this life. So if I can ever be a resource to you, you have my number. I have more business cards if you want it. I'm not a crisis worker, but I'll tell you who they are, and I'm always going to point back to 988 in a crisis or the local crisis team down at Plateau Mental Health Center. But if you want materials, or you know, if you want me to come talk to some group you have or anything like that, please feel free to reach out. My email's on the business card. I thank you for your time. I appreciate you being here and willing to hear this message. We've got a lot of work to do and a lot of lives to save, but I think we're headed in the right direction. So thanks for being here. Thanks for having me.